So for the first panel for the afternoon, I'd like to invite the Honorable Frank Kramer up here to be in charge of moderating that panel and have the rest of the panelists come join us. This panel will be focused on the topic of unconventional uses of cyber between war and peace. And the one thing I'm certain about it shall not be boring. So Frank, let me get the rest of you. One ambassador from the Ukraine will be a few minutes late, but I'll bring him through the back and he'll quietly join you guys. So Frank, I'll get the rest of you people.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, as Catherine said, my name is Frank Kramer. I'm going to moderate this panel. I think what we're going to talk about follows on very nicely with what Kieran Martin discussed. He made a distinction, but then brought together the national security elements and the economic elements. And one of the questions I think we will have as we talk about this is, what does one do in this, as the title says, in this area between war and peace, both with respect to national security, but also with respect to economic sets of issues. There are lots of ways to look at cyber. You can look at it horizontally, so to speak, focused on the technical underlying aspects. You can look at it in verticals, what do you do for the grid? What do you do for other elements of the private sector, financial, telecoms, whatever. But there's also the issue of what state, if you will, are you in? And this question that we've put in the title is, what does the state between war and peace really mean? Where are we really? Is it focused on a particular country, Russia, or multiple countries, Iran, North Korea, China? Are those all between war and peace? Are they differentiated? And if so, what do you really do with respect to that? Is it just cyber that we really need to think about, or do you need to think about the comprehensive set of relations? There's a word that a lot of us have used, so-called hybrid. What does hybrid mean with respect to cyber? What does it imply that you do? And how does it connect to the other parts of hybrid warfare or hybrid conflict or hybrid challenge, whatever you choose to call it? We have things like low-level conflict that could be kidnapping of an Estonia border guard, attempted assassinations in Montenegro, but those are associated often with cyber attempts, both at an attack level and an information level. We have economic and political subversion in various countries. The candidate who's leading in France, or was the leading candidate in the first round, his campaign was attacked continuously. What does that mean? We have the reference earlier to the attack on TV5 in France, or the Ukraine attack, which I'm sure the ambassador, when he's here, will talk about. And then we have, obviously, the whole set of information warfare that includes fake news. Some of you may have been at the panel on that. But it includes lots more kinds of things. And for example, in the UK, RT, Russia Today, has been sanctioned by the Office of Communications multiple times because of unobjective approaches to reporting pursuant to their law. Different than the US, but an interesting set of questions. So the panel's got a lot in front of it. As Catherine said, the ambassador will be in late. We'll give him his chance to catch up. He and I have talked. But for now, I'm going to just ask to go in more or less the order that you see. So I'll start with, and you all have the biographies, so I'm not going to go through the biographies. These are all highly distinguished people that I'm proud to have on the panel and proud to know. So let me start just with Sorin, then we'll go to Colonel Duggan, Jarno, and Florian Schaurer. So in that order, Sorin, do you want to start?
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's great to be at this conference, one of the opportunities that I had the chance to learn a lot. But I particularly like the title of this panel. And I should start with something that you might find surprising, and that is the fact that, and I'm in NATO for a bit more than a decade, first being member of the North Atlantic Council, and then in the last almost 4 years on the international staff. I would say that it was this decade interval that NATO evolved in the field of cyber defense from what I would call kind of policy cyber defense ignorance, or even I would say illiteracy, and it might be sounding shocking because we were used to address this issue like just a technical issue, just like any other business. And it was only after 2007, the attacks against Estonia, that we started to address cyber defense at policy level through the first policy of 2008 at the Bucharest summit. Since then, I would argue that the cyber defense policy development could be seen as something of a model, or being at the core of NATO's modernization. Why I'm saying this? NATO has developed or has been initially created to be able to deter and prepare to defend the alliance against any potential threats, against any potential attacks. But to quote our Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, in the cyber domain today, we are under attack. So while in the other domains of air, land, and sea, we are pretty much operating according to our legacy approach of being prepared to defend and deter. Frankly, in cyber, we are exactly in this, let's say, interval below the threshold of, let's say, armed attack that would, trigger collective self-defense and so on, but definitely not in a full, in the situation of peace enjoyment, so to say. And this is pretty much the environment that we are supposed to kind of operate nowadays. We see the intention of attacker operating below the threshold of any meaningful response. And I think this will oblige us to be even more agile, adaptive, intelligent in so many ways. And frankly, the hybrid context is the more complex manifestation of this situation. But I thought cyber is a good example to express how the approach and how we could have achieved the good dynamics in quite a short interval. So it's less than 10 years since NATO has addressed cyber as a policy issue. It's frankly less than 3 years since the Wales summit that NATO has linked cyber defense with its reason of being, with collective defense. It was not ready to do this after 2007, although there were long debates after the Estonian attack. But 2014 were other events linked mainly to the Ukraine crisis within and around Ukraine that led very much to this approach. And it a bit less than 1 year since NATO has recognized cyberspace as a domain of operations in which it has to be able to defend itself as effectively as in the domains of land, air, or sea. So, while frankly the issue of operating, let's say, above the level of armed attack is kind of sorted out by linking cyber defense to collective defense and to the possibility to address Article 5. And by the way, Article 5 is never imply any automaticities, always a political decision on a case-by-case basis, and of course there's also never an implication that any response could or should be in kind. It could be with many means, political means, or if necessary even with military means. While addressing this, we have been also able to recognize that whatever we do, our normal business or our operational engagement, this will happen in an environment in the cyber environment that will be increasingly contested. So this has generated a mind shift from addressing cyber as a mainly technical enabler. We moved from the information assurance paradigm, where the assumption was, well, you hire as many good technicians, you procure the best IT hardware and software, and then you can rely on the information and you go on with your operations and missions. Actually, this is not, it cannot be verified. This is not a correct assumption. So the assumption is that we are and will continue to operate in a heavily contested environment, and then we need to move in a mindset of mission assurance to be able to achieve the mission, the objectives, even under this, this contested environment. A couple of very quick highlights that I wanted to mention, and then I will stop and we'll be able for questions and answers. So what we've done, a part of having dynamic evolution of policy. We are today at the NATO Cyber Policy 3.0. First was 2008, and we were 2011, then 2014. We have achieved the centralized protection of NATO networks across the NATO enterprise, about 63 sites as we speak. We have introduced cyber defense capability targets in the NATO defense planning process, very much like with the other capability targets, so that we can harmonize cyber defense across all allies. Furthermore, last year we adopted a cyber defense pledge just to make a point that cyber defense should be prioritized among the defense in general. We provided a frame of assistance to allies in case of attack, established information and analysis sharing arrangements, either through MOU with each member states and through a malware information sharing platform where malware can be really addressed in real time. We established partnerships with partner nations on a case-by-case basis based on trust and mutual interest with international organizations, and with EU in particular. We have a technical arrangement on cyber defense cooperation. And also we established what we call the NICP, NATO Industry Cyber Partnership, since 2014, a partnership with industry and academia. I think this partnership approach has paid off a lot. We used to say that cyber defense is a team sport, but especially the partnership with industry has significantly increased our situational awareness. Now, last but not least, I should mention increased intelligence sharing within cyber, especially in the last year, and now with the establishment of NATO's Intelligence and Security Division, we are able not to have a good analysis on what happens technically on our networks, but blend this with the best human intelligence to get the, let's say, high granularity attribution and understanding, and also understanding strategically what are the trends, motivations, and what environment we are living in. Of course, we have updated our crisis management manual and introduced cyber defense under this mission assurance paradigm in training, in planning, and in exercises. So just to give you a few examples of highlights nowadays. As we speak, we are focused on the first annual report on how each ally nation delivers on the cyber defense pledge. and I think the output will be around our high-level meeting end of May, and to focus on the implementation roadmap that addresses the implications of recognized cyberspace as a domain of operations. I will stop here, but of course Hal will be ready.
Thank you very much. Patrick?
Hey, so good afternoon, everybody. Forewarn you, my pitch is going to be a little bit fast and hard, so just a fair warning. Before I get started, I want to be sure and thank Georgetown University, Dr. Catherine Lotriante, where are you at? I think she's somewhere around here. I recognize my esteemed panel members. It's really an honor to be up here with so many luminaries and accomplished leaders. So, all right, my name's Colonel Pat Duggan. I'm a career Special Forces officer, but I'm not going to jump from a plane, eat a snake, or ride a horse or anything like that. Instead, I'm going to do something even more bizarre. Some Special Forces guy, I'm going to talk to you about cyberspace, specifically the unconventional use of cyber between war and peace. And while my interests and my passions are at the nexus of special warfare and cyber warfare, everything I posit is really about better understanding the human dimension of cyber. And I firmly believe more than anything else, whether we're talking about cyber warfare, hybrid warfare, special warfare, information warfare, gray zone conflict, or whatever, that humans are the immutable element to all of it. And in order to better understand the unconventional use of cyber, we must first start viewing and considering cyber for its human potential. So to unpack that notion, there's two themes I'm going to hit on. Number one, we must change our institutional biases towards cyber. Far too often when it comes to cyber discussions, we get over-focused on the technical, and leaders get uncomfortable by the porpoise speak. Maybe us leaders are frankly just too old, and it's a digitally native thing that's going to work itself out. But in the meantime, I think we have mislabeled cyber as simply an intel or a signals thing, when the fact of the matter is cyber is an everybody thing, and every single military branch, service, and discipline has a critical role to play. Take Special Operations Forces, or SOF, my own community, who, in my opinion, in the next 10 years, every single SEAL, Green Beret, and Ranger better understand the basics of cryptography, computers, and coding, not because they need to be programmers, but because those skills will be essential to their very survival in an era exponentially more interconnected than now. Even more, mastering the basics is critical to the next step, exploring unconventional concepts to employ cutting-edge, ever-affordable technologies against a growing zoo of tech-savvy threats. Meaning, fundamentally, cyber is not really a thing problem at all, it's a cultural one. Number two, we must innovate more human-centric ideas, concepts, and theories about cyber. As you all know, technology in of itself only matters if it drives new concepts. And for the military, new constructs to fight. And as tomorrow's character of conflict continues to rapidly digitize, the space between the virtual world and physical world will shrink. And to fight in this ever-constricting little space will require as many methods to compete in the virtual minds of men as it does the real world. To do this, we must reject notions that only promote centralized technical approaches to cyber, and instead consider more multidisciplined, human-based, and diverse theories for it. So then a fair question becomes, all right, Mr. Soft Guy, what's your theory of special operations in cyber? Well, I'm glad you asked. The answer is all about leveraging cyber's asymmetry to amplify the elemental aspects of what makes a special operation special. Meaning, if correctly applied to eliminate hostile threats, cyberspace would amplify a direct action mission's lethality, precision, and discrete nature. While to build partners' capacity and security in a foreign internal defense operation, cyberspace would amplify interoperability, capability, and trust. You see, cyberspace is an extension of societal ideals and expressed thoughts, with its true meaning and value to a society culturally and psychologically determined, and therefore subject to influence. The unconventional use of cyber means understanding how a society's interactions with cyber mirrors itself, and then harnessing that space of codependence to amplify our intentions. This means that in the future, the keys to unlocking unconventional cyber's true untapped potential lay less with technical attacks of intensity, power, and energy, but more with discrete human attacks of influence, nuance, and persuasion. The unconventional application of cyber is about exploiting a deeper understanding of techno-social interactions and contextualizing the socio-cultural, political, and historical factors to either constructively, but unfortunately more often than not, destructively expand preconceived notions of what is and what isn't war. Today, any nation, person, or actor can shape cultures, influence relationships, and regulate tension, whether shaping an environment to keep conflicts from breaking out or stoking techno-societal warfare. This new ability equates to coercive power whose instrumentality is driven by the humans in the space. So, in conclusion, to better understand the unconventional use of cyber means first accepting cyber as a human space, but more importantly, recognizing that everybody will play a role, even and especially soft.
Thanks very much. We're going to come back to some of those points in the discussion. Jarno?
Thank you very much. First of all, I have to say that coming from Finland and as a Finn, I don't even know how to speak in that fast and dynamic way how you do. But I try to figure it out. Thank you very much for the invitation. So this is not going to be so fast and dynamic. Anyway, thank you very much for the invitation. This is my 4th time in this conference, and I have to say that this is always excellent with all you people and all these discussions. But let me start emphasizing that when we discuss here cyber in the context of hybrid warfare, it's worth keeping in mind that at the moment this is happening. And this is reality in many countries in Europe as we speak. We also need to keep in our minds the increased importance of the non-military and non-kinetic elements of today's warfare. I also see that it's necessary that when we evaluate cyber activities, they should not be separated from the larger strategic and political contexts. If we do that, we will lose. Cyber is, of course, integral element in modern wars and conflicts, but there are not cyber-only wars, not even hybrid ones. Especially in the context of hybrid warfare, it's better to say that cyber penetrates all the simultaneously used instruments of power. And hybrid warfare occurs in multiple levels: tactics, operations, strategic at the same time. But strategically, I argue that much more attention should be paid to so-called cyber psychological activities and effects of them than what we are usually concentrating to so-called cyber technical. Let me be clear here. When we talk about Russia, strategically, Russia has ability to coordinate various instruments of national power in an agile way. And Western open societies are vulnerable to these effects. But information warfare, which of course is utilizing cyberspace, plays a prominent role in this strategic hybrid warfare context. It is used to shape our social culture, our thoughts, our cognition environment continuously, and of course not only in the times of war. Hybrid warfare intentionally blurs the distinction between the times of war and peace, and war and making it hard for targeted countries to devise policy responses in a proper and timely manner. From the cyber perspective, the rise of the cyberspace is an operating environment which is a key enabler for hybrid warfare. Key enabler. Cyberspace offers a way to easily combine fighting areas, including espionage, information operations, and conventional combat, and to do so behind a curtain of plausible deniability. But especially, cyberspace provides a path to manipulate information sphere and influence public opinion and policy decisions. Hybrid warfare is mostly population-centric. And I argue that in coming years, the main battles in hybrid warfare are battles of narratives. When we are discussing hybrid warfare, we are not discussing war and peace. We are discussing which is the new normal in our security environment in Europe. Grey time. And this color will prevail for a long time. Therefore, we need to understand what victory means during grey time. Hybrid warfare, I argue, challenges our understanding of what victory looks like when the beginning and ending of war become blurred. At the same time, military theory has largely been preoccupied with the military victory in the traditional battlefield victory sense rather than addressing the psychological or cognitive side of victory. Yet our adversaries might not be seeking to achieve military victory according to our logics, but some other goal, such as pursuing individual or multiple populations. I think it's very important to keep in mind that the art of war is developing all the time, and we may have to rethink our understanding of victory. I see one thing here predictable. Cyber capabilities are attractive as weapons of choice in any hybrid warfare scenario in coming years. The key targets for hybrid operations are identified vulnerabilities or weaknesses in the targeted country. These vulnerabilities can be identified from any of the vital parts of a society. Adversaries' goal is to figure out these weaknesses, where there are greatest asymmetries available, which targets are easiest to attack, and how the attacks should be orchestrated so that maximum impact could be achieved. Yes, we should pay a special attention to elections and election security in Europe this year. Ladies and gentlemen, hybrid threats are a European and a transatlantic priority. Hybrid activities have become a permanent part of our security environment. Hybrid threats are an international issue. The response should be too. In Helsinki, my capital, a concrete step to strengthen cooperation was taken actually a few weeks ago. The establishment of the European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats was signed by many EU and NATO countries. This centre is open for EU members and NATO allies. The centre, ICCE, represents a concrete step building resilience to hybrid threats, and the centre will serve as a hub of subject matter expertise. I see also that the centre is a real boost for the cooperation between European Union and NATO, facing the challenge of hybrid threats together. I see as my final point that countering hybrid threats is and must be a transatlantic priority. I am sure that this now established centre will provide a valuable forum for EU-NATO cooperation in this field. Our unity and our success goes hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Schaurer?
Thank you very much indeed. It's an honor being here, and thank you very much, Professor Limnéll. You mentioned a lot of the topics I was going to raise, so I can keep it quite briefly to maybe demonstrate a bit about the German perspectives and the EU perspectives with regards to hybrid warfare, which is more or less my background too. And as we heard before, cyber is bigger than just the technical aspects of it, and that's pretty much the thing that I'm addressing, or that I want to address at this panel too, the informational influence aspects of it, the human domain, the gray zone, whatever you call it. It's bigger than that. Obviously, the unconventional use of cyber between war and peace, it's something we don't yet fully understand, and it's something we don't fully feel comfortable with. But I think the same applies to the conventional use of cyber as well. So, as our Chancellor Merkel has repeatedly called it, it's the Neuland. It's like a new island we discovered. I mean, it's been discovered for quite a while now, and not everything is new to us, but still we need to find ways to cope with the challenges cyberspace poses in the informational domain. We need to be precise in the definitions of what we mean with cyberspace, with hybrid. Recognizing cyber as an operational domain in NATO last year was certainly a big step forward. But then again, I mean, it's just recognizing the obvious. You just had to recognize it as an operational domain because it was just there. Not recognizing it would have sent a different political signal, which we tried to avoid. Both cyber and hybrid, I think, are political buzzwords, and we are all aware of that, and we are all not really comfortable with the two terms. But then again, I think they are not worthless either, because it's two very concise words to at least politically and publicly popularize challenges we face. And I think for political reasons, and I'm working in the political branch in the Ministry of Defense in Germany, those terms, both cyber and hybrid, although they don't really describe what we're talking about, those terms do have some value. So when we're talking about the unconventional use of cyber between war and space, I think there's two aspects to it. The one is, what is this unconventional use? And the other thing is, who is doing, who's using cyber unconventionally? Who are the actors and the players behind it? So with regards to what, we heard there's quite some potential qualifiers for that. There is certainly legality, the threshold, Article 51 threshold, self-defense, individually or collective self-defense, armed attack, all those kinds of things which really do matter. We heard before that norms in cyberspace do play an increasing role, but then again, norms are not everything, because even if I trust my neighbors, I still lock the doors. So there still is quite an argument to make about defense, I believe. And we need to be serious about that. Although the armed attack threshold, I think, is hard to apply to everything we see in hybrid constellations, particularly with regards to Ukraine, and I'm sure the Ukrainian ambassador will say something about it. Hybrid warfare or hybrid influence is not necessarily unviolent, and that's a very important thing to keep in mind. The other qualifier for what is the unconventional use might be ambiguity, deniability, who is behind it, attribution, or even before that, detection. Because oftentimes it's not only who is behind it, but what are we actually seeing? Is this a hybrid campaign? Is this just, I don't know, so some kid posting comments on Breitbart News? Sometimes we just don't know what we're seeing. And is it part of a campaign, yes or no? If it is part of a bigger campaign by a state behaving like a non-state actor, then there's certainly some responsibility for government. But if not, I mean, that's covered as freedom of speech and so on. Asymmetry was mentioned before, and I think it's a key qualifier too, because what we are seeing as hybrid influence campaigns, it's happening under conditions of overall conventional inferiority. And that's important to recognize. It's high impact, low cost. That's pretty much the idea behind it. It's a dynamic continuum. It's a gray zone. Human domain aspects, whatever you call it, play an increasing role. What we have in mind when we talk hybrid is that cyber, or the unconventional use of cyber, goes beyond the operational domain it emanates from. That means there are effects in cyberspace and there are effects through cyberspace. And particularly those through cyberspace are those I'm particularly interested in. Through cyberspace, they potentially have a global audience, so your informational sphere of influence is potentially global. So we can certainly talk about something like information geopolitics, and we can apply some concepts, at least, of geopolitics to the cyber or information domain too, like A2AD operations, which also happen in cyberspace. They target society as a whole, and that's what makes it so difficult. Hybrid threats, they exploit vulnerabilities. They exploit the interfaces we're having, and believe me, in Germany we have a lot of them. Who's responsible for that? Is it the military? Is it Interior Ministry? Is it intelligence services? In Germany, intelligence and police forces are separated for historical reasons. So we see that between this, at the different stages of escalation between bits and bullets, if you so wish, there is a lot of people, organizations affected, both private sector and government, but oftentimes responsibilities are not clear. And that does not only apply to, for example, Germany, which is a federal state, so we have 16 federal states plus national government, then of course we have NATO and EU. So it doesn't make it easier to coordinate it and to appropriately respond to hybrid influence. With regards to the WHO, I think since we are uncomfortable with this whole concept of hybrid influence, it's always the others who do it, and it's not us who do it. That's for sure. That's the first thing to say. But I think there's two perspectives. Basically, it's the defender's perspective, and it's the adversary's perspective. And I think this really fundamentally changes what we're talking about, depending on what side of the barrel you're on. Of course, we are on the defender's perspective. But then again, you know, even what we call hybrid adversaries, and we certainly have some countries in mind there when we talk about hybrid adversaries or hybrid actors, and it is mainly state actors we are considering as hybrid actors, particularly a great regional power in the East, but it's certainly not the only hybrid actor we are currently dealing with. With regards to the WHO, I think us being the defenders, we have to play by different rules than the adversary, because the adversary, the competitive edge the adversary has is pretty much not sticking to the rules we consider to be guiding for our actions. So that's another asymmetry. But just to wrap it up, and then maybe go to the discussion, or I think there is still a beacon of hope with regards to hybrid influence, hybrid warfare campaigns, and it's two different issues, but the beacon of hope is that I think the ultimate strategic goal of being a hybrid adversary or hybrid actor is avoiding open military exchange, open violent conflict. But then again, there is violent conflict in hybrid warfare or hybrid warfare through violent means. But that means I think we don't only live and act politically under conditions of hybrid war, but also under conditions of hybrid peace, particularly in the West. And I think that's something we should see as some beacon of hope too, that maybe it's not the worst mode in international relations with regards to non-military conflict resolutions, and particularly Western Europe has been through two great wars in the last century. So maybe the hybrid peace environment is not the thing we should really be hysteric about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, we're delighted that you're here. You've come just in time, so you haven't missed anything in terms of being on the panel. So if we could hear your presentation, I'd be delighted to see what's your views with respect to Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you know, for Ukraine, thank you, by the way, for invitation. When I spoke for the first time here in this room 14 years ago, we not use the hybrid. We use hybrid like a car, hybrid car or something like that. But, you know, we are Ukraine, we are face this threat among the first in the world. And it's not only for us like a discussion, it's a real, very damage impact. We lose 10,000 people and almost 3,000 soldiers and officers. So for us, what is a part of the unconventional war, cyber attacks, is something very important and in very concrete things. So before I make my comments on that, I would like to give you some examples, very concrete examples of cyber attack against Ukraine in the last years. We're 3 years in fact, in state of war, but we do not want to put all the country in the war. So we have a touchline, we have a peace process, we have a diplomatic efforts. Appreciate just back from the one additional meeting, the United States help us with the Western Alliance, help us a lot to maintain not a hybrid peace, but real peace. And we can imagine that having more than 700 tanks, Russian tanks, and we have evidence of that, intelligence of that, in our territory, we seriously taken this, another part of this hybrid unconventional war against Ukraine as a cyber attack. Since the beginning of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the country has experienced a wave of cyber attacks. The hackers are mainly targeting critical infrastructure like power supplies, as well as state-managed services. Ukrainian authorities have clear evidence that all these attacks are coming from Russia. For example, in December 2016, Ukraine suffered a series of attacks on its finance and defense ministries. A suspected hack also wiped out part of Kiev's power grid for the first time. I'm a Kievan, and I'm not remember the same in the previous times, causing a blackout in part of the capital. The blackout lasted just over an hour and started just before midnight on 17th of December. The power cut had amounted to a loss of about 1/5 of Kiev's power consumption. A similar attack hit the Ivano-Frankivsk region, it's the western part of Ukraine, in December 2015. At that time, it was widely viewed as the first major assault on the nation's power grid. Hackers have targeted Ukrainian state institutions about 6,500 times in November and December alone, what clearly demonstrates that Russian security services are waging a real cyber war against Ukraine. Among these 6,500 attacks, the country had been hit by the attack on the state treasury, halted its system for several days, meaning state workers and pensioners had been unable to receive their salaries or payments on time. In our case, it's very important because we're still paying pensions even for those people who live in the temporarily occupied territories. That's why it's like a type of attack that should demonstrate that we're not able to find a peace solution. In February 2017, cybersecurity firm CyberX said that it had uncovered a separate espionage operation in Ukraine that had compromised more than 60 victims, including the energy minister, a scientific research institute, and a firm that designs remote monitoring systems for oil and gas pipelines. Russia was making constant attempts to interfere in our election. The first, it was presidential election campaign in Ukraine in 2014. On May 22, 2014, prior to the elections scheduled for May 25, the elections unified information analysis system, the system designed to announce preliminary results on the process of voting and counting of votes, was blocked. The computer system of the Central Election Commission became inoperable, and most of the data files were deleted or made inaccessible. Malware could not be neutralized with the licensed Russian-made Kaspersky antivirus software installed in the system. Ukrainian specialists managed to promptly address the threat and to minimize negative consequences of the external interference. On May 23, 2014, hacker group Cyber-Berkut, which according to available data, open data, is controlled by the Russian Secret Service and is responsible for cyber attacks on information infrastructure of Ukrainian state institutions, released files and official correspondence from computers of the Central Election Commission of Ukraine, including network and cybersecurity technical documentation, as well as password to all network devices on its website, cyber-berkut.org. Ukrainian security experts revealed that over 20 Central Election Commission's computers, including the server, were infected with the malware later detected as Sophosy virus, created by ART28 hacker group. This group reportedly acts in the interest of the Russian Federation's secret services and was involved in the targeting cyber attacks on electronic information resources in Ukraine, European countries, and the United States of America. The virus is intended to steal restricted information and make destructive impact on electronic information resources, including software. You know, I just read it because it's official information. It's publicly said by President, Minister of Foreign Affairs, many years. So now not time to present new evidences of that. It's a time to find the best response. And we are ready to work together. We appreciate this very intensive work on bilateral levels and with NATO. We have groups that are seriously taking this threat. Ukrainians has very great potential to contribute in the software, on the intellectual level on that. We have a young generation who is, ready for new challenges, and I believe they will find the best mechanism how to coordinate this common efforts for our common threat. So once again, thank you very much. That you have a great opportunity to hear from those who deal with it a long time. And I believe this will continue that because next years, unfortunately, this threat remain actual. Thank you very much for your attention.
So let me thank all the panelists. I have a question actually for each of you. So I'm going to walk right down the list that we talked about. So if I can start with Sorin. So NATO appropriately bills itself as a defensive alliance. So it's focused on deterrence. In the cyber arena, you can have deterrence by denial, by resilience, by capability for raising costs, counter-offense. But here we are in this period between war and peace. So as you said in your presentation, below Article 5. So what does NATO need to do? What would be most appropriate for NATO to do to help create a better overall environment, given that we are not yet in an Article 5 situation? What would be the key steps going forward?
As you mentioned, the strong focus is on resilience and on denying potential attackers the benefit of their attack. Frankly, while this is a dynamic thing, so you can never be safe, and there has to be, we need to try to keep up with the growing threat landscape. I think it was an approach worthwhile to take, and many of the benchmarks that NATO have set both for its own networks and for those national networks that are strategically important, military network, government networks, and so on, for which we have capability targets. We see now that they are taken or considered by nations also for critical infrastructure, and it's logical because you cannot operate strategic networks, not even military, if you don't secure the critical infrastructure. So I think deterrence by denial should not, its importance should not be underestimated. The next thing is, and what we're very much focusing right now, is to be able to have quite deep understanding and situational awareness of what we're facing, both as an organization and also nations separately. And I think the trend that one could see last year in a number of nations, that of coming out publicly with public attribution based on thorough analysis, both technical and intelligence analysis, that in itself sends a message that attackers cannot really ride free, or they're not completely stealth. I mean, it's the message that we see you and so on. I think that the sense of reach out and the practice that states should also, so active practice of being open what happens in their systems and how they're responding. And last but not least, I think we should not underestimate the role of the development of norms and the confidence building measures. And this was the subject of another panel, and I think it was excellently covered. They themselves can have a deterrent effect. It sometimes is prestige. Other times it could be some responsibility that could be put on the attackers, and probably these are the best ways forward in this, let's say, spectrum between hybrid peace and below the threshold of warfare.
Thank you very much. Colonel, if I can push you a little bit, so it's publicly acknowledged that U.S. Special Forces are engaged in Syria and in the counter-ISIS fight, right? And the prior Secretary of Defense also announced that we are using cyber capabilities in that fight. It wasn't specific. But could you talk a little bit about, either in that context or otherwise, what would you like to see the Special Forces, Special Operations Forces capabilities be able to do in your future use of cyber, as you suggested? For example, what would be the useful thing to do with respect, and maybe it's with respect to the local populations, maybe it's respect to the various militias that are existing, maybe it's respect to the opposition in the context of Syria, or if that's not a good example, that's okay, use one that you like.
No, thanks, Dr. Kramer. So if I can even step back from that one, I think what I would love to see is a greater adaptation of an unconventional mindset towards cyber, and acknowledging that, in essence, cyber warfare is at its core human warfare. And it's as deceptive and unpredictable as human nature. It's about imposing your will on somebody else and recognizing that really cyber's cognitive impacts have more latent energy than its kinetic impacts, and that we can mobilize that. And I think we have to change our mindsets writ large and are challenging the deep-seated and narrow cultural preferences we have for principled and idealistic warfare. And we really need to start thinking in terms of subjective and psychologically driven. The second piece of that is I would love to see adopting a more unconventional practice of cyber, meaning it's about beating an adversary or competitor. It's beating his decision-making calculus and not engaging him in battle, right? It's systemically seeking deep insights into his culture and his complex relationship with information and his society's trust in data. You know, cyber's just this virtual vehicle. It's about penetrating digital networks to seek an understanding of the complexities of an adversary, how he processes, how he perceives, how he interprets information, and how it influences his behavior. So I think there's a holistic, fundamental, unconventional mindset that we need to change first, and then we can address some of the hypotheticals after that.
Thank you. Jarno, so you talking about what victory looks like. So here in the U.S., we had the DNC attacks, which were actually a hack and release kind of situation. In France, Emmanuel Macron's campaign was attacked through a whole series of troll presentations, or whatever you want to call it, a great deal of trolling with respect to who he was, what he was about, et cetera, et cetera. So does victory mean that we're going to be able to limit those in a significant way? Do we really need to think about particular cases like election? Do we need to cut back on cyber trolling? I mean, what do you really want to have accomplished?
I think this is extremely important question and observation, because when we are talking about the Western democracies, elections are in the heart of these democracies. So we have to have, the people have to have the trust about the voting. They have to have the trust that yes, the right people were selected who were voted most. And what I have noticed, and this is under my research at the moment, that I think elections is also extremely good example that you can't just approach this from the cyber perspective. Because if you are just using your imagination, you can really find many ways how to influence, if you want, to other nations' elections. And especially trying to weaken the people's trust on that elections. And as I mentioned, but I will repeat this, I see that one of the key areas, if we should concentrate in the research at the moment in this very wide range hybrid warfare reality, is the elections and how we maintain the people's trust on the elections and the right of it. Extremely important.
So, Dr. Schaurer, so one of the things I remember, I don't remember the exact time, but when Chancellor Merkel was in China, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago, she was one of the first people to raise the issue of Chinese espionage publicly. Since then, multiple people have done it, and of course the U.S. Ended up indicting a certain number of Chinese individuals, and then apparently concluded an agreement with China, which some people say has actually had some beneficial effect with respect to commercial spying. So the question I would have for you is, when we talk about these issues of unconventional use of cyber between war and peace, do you include the economic part, or is it just the national security part? We heard Kieran Martin talk about the two elements and how he thought they were connected. How do you see it, and how does the German government see it? How does the German public see it? Obviously, Germany depends heavily on its advanced capabilities in manufacturing, technology, et cetera. How do you put those together?
Yeah, that's certainly true that Germany's strongest defense is a strong economy, basically. That's certainly true. Being a major European economic power, of course, this heavily affects German industry, and there is close cooperation, particularly between domestic intelligence services and major firms in order to raise awareness, to make them report incidents, to not only deal with incidents on their own. That's certainly a big topic behind the scenes. But with regards to the public, I would say that the whole economic dimension of the threat is not so much in focus. It's really about the political threat mainly. As you know, we do have general elections upcoming this September too. And quite honestly, political decision makers in Germany are concerned, and not so much about the technical aspects of it. There is scenario planning, there is redundant systems. I see a lot of fax machines being bought again and installed again and all that kind of stuff to have redundant technical systems. But then again, the real concern, and the public concern too, is I think that there is interference operations through informational means. And that is where I think the deterrence really plays a big role too, and not only deterrence through resilience, through denial, and so on and so forth, but deterrence through transparency too. We need to explain our policies better. We need to explain our processes, our normative understanding of how society should function and what the core values of society are. We should be more transparent about that, because there is an increasing lack of trust between voters and political decision makers also in Germany. There is a rise in right-wing populism or in populist agenda in general. And so I think it's really beyond the technical aspects of it and beyond the political aspects. It was not only Chancellor Merkel in China, but it was also her famous saying when the NSA revelations came out that friends don't spy on each other, das geht gar nicht. This is not possible, that's not something friends do. And then Obama was calling her and saying, yeah, we're friends and we don't do this. And so that pretty much ended the discussion, and we of course believe that you no longer do this as long as Angela Merkel is Chancellor at least. But I really think transparency is a key issue here, and we need to explain our policies better, and that's increasingly difficult because there are competing narratives, and it's not only raising literacy, media literacy, making people read better newspapers, because, I mean, the people in question here who are lacking most of the trust, these are people you don't reach through the quality newspapers and so on. It's not that quality media needs to do better reporting, it's how do we get those people to include other sources in their political considerations again? And that's why I think transparency really plays a role. And in the words of one of the Georgetown students who posed a question to Dr. Gurka at the fake news panel today, don't be a jerk. I mean, really don't be a jerk as a political decision maker too. I think that's very important. Don't lie. be strong enough to excuse yourself for wrong decisions you certainly have made in your political career. And then I think you increase your resilience towards leaks, for example. I mean, the leaks are not the problem. The problem is how you deal with those leaks, basically, as a political decision maker. How do you deal with it? Do you deny that you're responsible? Do you call them fake news? Or do you say, yes, I'm sorry, I screwed it up? And I think so there is a lot of transparency to do from the political side, too, to really improve the situation.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, the list that you gave of all the difficulties, I'll say, that Ukraine has faced in the cyber arena, I think is well accepted, certainly in the West, as to things that have actually been done. So my question for you is, obviously with respect to Crimea, the United States, the EU for multiple European countries and other countries have put on sanctions on the Russians. Do you think that, well, maybe the way to say it is, what additional help might you want in the cyber arena? And as a specific subset of that, do you think that we ought to look towards multinational sanctions because of cyber intrusions, just the way we look to multinational sanctions because of what was done in Crimea? Because interference, as you pointed out, in the electoral process really goes to the heart of a country.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this question, because, you know, this is a very important issue in the Congress. Now in the Congress prepared the bill to respond to the cyber attack, and including Crimea. What's our most concern? That we are, unfortunately, Ukraine not control situation in Crimea, and we have the nuclear weapons carriers, Russian nuclear weapons carriers, and we can control what's happened with that. So we formally responsible according to international law, because it's still our territory temporarily occupied as a legal annexation, but we do not have any instrument how to avoid this type of threats, including possible cyber attack for critical infrastructure. So it's most our concern about the nuclear plants, about the chemical storages, about everything that exists in the Crimea Peninsula. And most important, that Russia now create from Crimea Peninsula not a resort like we plan to do, but a military base. And that's a real problem. So most our concern about uncontrol, we not include now in our case that we are won in the International Court of Justice. We spoke mostly about the, you know, there's some violation of the human rights, but I think it will be next package in the future, and we cooperate a lot, because doesn't matter who is now, you know, named here as a responsible part, but what's most important, how we have efficient mechanism, how to avoid catastrophic developments. So Black Sea and Europe, the heart of Europe, Crimea Peninsula, critical important. We have this understanding not only in Pentagon and State Department and the intelligence agencies, but also in the Hill. So it's a complex issue, and I believe we will find the final decision how to stop any attempts to avoid responsibility, bringing new threat, in our case in Ukraine and territorial sentinel of Europe.
So I want to invite anyone who has questions to the microphone, and while people are going up, let me just ask the panel in general. Start with Jarno. Finland has started to open and operate the Center on Hybrid Warfare. So what would you say with respect to what ought to be the objectives of that center? And I'll raise it for all of you, not just per se the center, but it's a multinational effort. What would be the most important things that you think could come out of that activity?
Well, we don't know yet. That's the short answer, and very Finnish answer also. But of course, now it was established 11th April, and it's going to be operational, starting to work, the headquarters in Helsinki in autumn. In autumn, that's the timeline at the moment. I think the key research and strategic analysis questions will come from the membership countries. What are the exact areas they want to know better? But I think in general, I think one of the key points in every society is that we have to have a better model to identify what are the vulnerabilities and weaknesses in our critical infrastructures, in our open societies, because those are the targets what the adversary is usually trying to find out and hit against them. And of course, one thing is to increase the information sharing, research, information sharing, knowledge sharing, because this is something what we really, as we know, this is an international issue, so the response should be also very international. And then maybe the third point also, which many societies are emphasizing at the moment, and I see that this is a good thing for Finland, that we have been developing our whole of the society comprehensive security model more or less since after the Second World War. And we are not so big nation, but I would say, coming from Finland, saying that maybe this model could be a very good example to other countries, how the interagency, how the cooperation works, how the whole society's cooperation really works in a trustful way in order to confront hybrid threats. Because they are very multiple, the threats, then of course the defense has to do the same.
Sorin?
Yeah, I would not try to attempt to say that I know more about what the aim should be rather than the finished host, but I thought it's worth to think about the role of the existing center of excellence, like the ones that NATO has, more than 20 nowadays. And they have this role of bringing a number of most interested players, nations together, to go deep into the understanding of the phenomenon and come with pilot solutions that could then be the source of policies within international organizations like NATO and EU, and establish a kind of uniform and coherent way forward. And frankly, it's very important because in hybrid response, I think the nations are the first responders, and it's important that we speak the same language and we have convergent action plans.
Anyone else want to join in? Or certainly.
Yeah. I think Germany is a founding member of the Finnish Center too, so we are very interested in not duplicating the efforts by the NATO centers, particularly with regards to Stratcom, for example, in Riga, or cyber defense, energy security centers that have done a great job in raising situational awareness, exchanging research, and so on and so forth. Maybe just let me add one thing about the vulnerabilities. I mean, those centers are not operational arms of government either way, but I think we have a very good grasp of vulnerabilities, hybrid vulnerabilities in German government and private sector. So I think it's not so much a lack of understanding where an aggressor might attack, and for that we have scenario planning, we do wargaming, red teaming, all that. And oftentimes this really works very well, for example, with regards to informational campaigns against the German armed forces in Lithuania. We do have a EFP battle group there. There is informational activities against this battle group. And this is things we planned like that. It's really going according to a playbook we prepared for. Of course, there can still be some strategic or tactical surprise, but I think we know the vulnerabilities, but we need to do better to coordinate efforts in government and with private sector as a whole of government approach. And that's really, I think, the problem we are facing right now. In Germany, certainly, okay, the Ministry of Defense is not responsible for cybersecurity of government networks. And so we really need to be clear how we better coordinate efforts, and I think that's really urgent and pressing, and we can't afford to wait until something bigger than the Lisa case happens.
Great. All right, let me turn to the audience. Sir?
Hello, I'm Jack Dempsey. I'm with the Office of Naval Intelligence. My question is on the topic of deterrence. I think deterrence really doesn't really work if it's not well communicated and based off of a threshold. It's pretty well understood if you shoot down my plane, if you shoot down, if you sink my ship, if you kill one of my citizens or my servicemen, that self-defense, inherent right of self-defense is applicable, and my response is well authorized as long as it's proportional in response. Since the gentleman, Mr. Ducaru, mentioned that yeah, we're in Europe, we're being attacked regularly, but not all attacks are reach that kind of critical threshold up to date that says, hey, we're going to have a counter value or counter force response in the information domain. Would it not be pragmatic that NATO consider as an addendum to Article 5 to say, hey, these identified critical infrastructures are critical for a reason, and therefore, if these things are attacked, telecommunications, energy, finance, we are being explicit that a counter value or counter force attack in the information domain in a proportionate fashion is going to happen. In line with Mr. Schaurer's comment about being transparent and communicative. Thank you.
So both declaratory policy and actual policy. So Sorin, why don't you take that on first, but then anyone else can jump in.
There is an open debate in NATO, for example, on how if there's going to be better to have a clear threshold, for example, in generating a collective defense response or not. And the conclusion was, and actually is no novelty because it was pretty much ingrained in the spirit of the Washington Treaty and the Article 5, is that, frankly, it would be, in general, it's better not to design any threshold for any collective response collective defense response for any Article 5, because then you would entice the adversary to always go beyond it. So it was for this reason that the approach is to have any Article 5 discussion only linked to a political decision, usually preceded by an Article 4 political debate, and then to discuss about response measures. Now, this being said, one of the reasons that NATO is so proactive in supporting this development, for example, of norms of responsible state behavior, and we have been also sponsoring work on this beyond the work of the UNGG through the Science for Peace and Security program with NGOs and so on, is because we want to send a message that attacking critical infrastructure, attacking CERTs, national CERTs and so on are hugely destabilizing actions, and they should be forbidden. I think there might be a certain point where nation states would develop declarative policies in this sense, then that this could be NATO-ized in a kind of consensual manner. We are not there yet, but we will depend, as again, NATO as a collective defense alliance based on consensus will evolve only as far as the nation states evolve. So while we see this probably developing within a number of nations, we could see this being NATO-ized as well, and I'm meaning the declaratory policy, which we don't have at this point.
Anyone else want to jump in? So let me just make a point that there is a doctrine in international law called countermeasures, and basically that says if something improper is being done to you as a nation, then you can respond in a way that you would not otherwise be able to respond. So, so to pick up on Sorin's point, one of the issues really that every nation needs to think through is to what extent does it want to use countermeasures? There's another word called retortions, which I'll leave Catherine to explain a little more clearly, but that's the stuff that you can always do. So sanctions are retortions, but countermeasures would be much more substantial if one chose to use them. And one of the questions I think that NATO will face is that NATO has always been about Article 5, armed attack, but what the questioner raised really was below the threshold of armed attack, but nonetheless significant, significant results occurring, as for example in Ukraine with respect to the grid being taken down, or as for example, as Kieran Martin mentioned, TV5 being taken down. Should we all think about using countermeasures in some significant way? And that's just an open question I think is before us all. Yes, sir.
Eric Rees from Deloitte. Professor Limnéll, if I took your meaning right, you seem to characterize this hybrid warfare as at least as much of, or perhaps more, a matter of narrative than technical. And Colonel Duggan, I feel like you sort of got at the same point when you were making, or you were emphasizing the importance of unconventional thinking. I'm not a technical person at all. I'm a PR guy, so the power of the narrative absolutely appeals to my sensibility. But my question is, with regard to certain kinds of state actors or states that really tightly control their populace's access to information to begin with, right? So if there's less of an attack surface for you to work with to begin with, how effective can that strategy be? Is that an effective strategy if, for example, the citizenry can't even access the sources of information that we might be able to infiltrate, influence behavior, beliefs through this sort of cyber approach?
Thank you. That's a very good question. In a way, I agree with some critics concerning about the concept of the hybrid warfare because it's so wide, and at the same time, if you are concentrating everything, you are concentrating nothing. But I see that there is a valuable use for this term to describe the complexity and the evolving character of the conflicts nowadays. What I was trying to say, and you got it, thanks for that, is that when we are thinking about the cyberspace, especially in this hybrid warfare context, we usually, academics, we separate that there is this physical layer, then content and communications layer, and then this social cultural layer in a way. And more or less, when we have been talking about the cyberspace, we have been talking about this communications and content layer in a way. Little by little, especially in the United States, nowadays also in the Europe, we are talking about more with cyber issues, this physical layer, like sea cables, how to secure them. And I think that is one of the raising more and more important area in coming years. But I see, then this is my argument, that when we are talking about the future of the cyberspace, and when we are talking about the targets, and when we are talking about the victory in hybrid warfare, we are primarily talking about our thoughts, our attitudes, our cognition. And it doesn't, this kind of influencing operation, it doesn't need to happen and achieve the victory within 1 week or 1 month. It can be 5 years, 10 years, little by little, affecting the general atmosphere, what people think, how the culture is being shaped. And I think in the research and also in policy, security policy, in many organizations and in many countries, they are not emphasizing this enough. And especially if we are talking from the east point of view, for them, cyber is primarily cyber psychological issue.
So real quick, if I could caveat that, what's intriguing to me, I think from a military optic is what is, cyber power. It's not equatable to possession. You can't own it, right? It's not located in any certain spot. You can't exercise command and control over it. So from a military optic, it's looking at cyber power in terms of persuasion and coercion, and you measure it by the types and the diversity of your networks, right? And you look at whatever actor you want to send that message to, and again, you asymmetrically use the types of your network against the types he doesn't have to amplify, right, your intentions, back to my earlier pitch. So if that answers your question.
Yes, ma'am.
Without getting into specifics.
So thanks, everyone. And first of all, what a distinguished panel, and we thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure to actually hear you guys talk today. A couple things. Colonel Duggan, I was like holding on to my chair like this when you were talking. The energy was so amazing. My hair was like, woo! It was really, really dynamic, and I loved it, so thank you. And I agree with you, cyber is not a vertical, it's certainly horizontal across everything that all of us are facing. And so we talked, and this gentleman just raised again the human aspects of it, and I just wonder, a lot of where the technology is going is towards the artificial intelligence piece of, just because there's so much data and getting your arms around everything that we're all faced with. What is the acceptance of that, certainly in warfare? We need the human aspect of making such a tough decision like that, but having the technology to help us make that decision, just because you've got to have something to gather everything that's going on at the line speed that it's going. So I haven't heard any of that today, and I was just wondering how you guys were feeling about it.
Do you want to jump in on the
real quick? So it's a cultural thing. It'll work itself out. I mean, I'm the lead bow wave of a digitally native crowd that's coming behind me that won't think twice about man-to-machine interfacing, say, this is my geolocated coordinate, this is where the bad guys are, whereas maybe a guy like me, I double-check it. So it's inexorable. It's going to work itself out, if that answers your question. I'm not hung up on it. But you have to keep the human in the loop, obviously, because it's all about framework and contextualizing that information.
Well, let me add to that. About 5 or 6 years ago, some folks at Lockheed Martin popularized the notion of the cyber kill chain, which many people have used, and depending on whose you see, it has 7 steps or 5 steps or whatever. But in any event, reconnaissance, getting the exploit in, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that AI may be able to do would be to evaluate what's going on inside, so to speak, machines in a much better way than even the current forensics are able to do, so that it would be able to help disrupting the kill chain, left to boom, so to speak. That may or may not be true. It may be truer for certain areas where machines are more interfacing. That might be where you have industrial control systems, it might be the grid, might not be. I hung out in the liberal arts and mostly failed that, so I just have a lot of fun with technology. But I think we are making tremendous amount of strides to utilize the capabilities of AI. For example, I think it was called DeepMind beat the Go champion a few months ago. So we're really early days, I think, and I think we haven't at all figured out, and that's not a criticism, as to the multiple places it really could be utilized. I agree with the Colonel that when you're undertaking war and you're undertaking to kill someone, you really want to make sure at some point the human's in the chain. But we do have fire and forget weapons, so what that means to have the human in the chain, is yet to be determined. But on the left of boom side, so to speak, I think there's a whole lot of stuff that AI can do, and I think your question raises it properly. It just hasn't yet been worked out.
Thank you very much.
Sir?
Yes. Vern Williams, wanted to ask what the impact on the cyber component of hybrid warfare of the assurance or integrity of the supply chain for both hardware and software in your environments.
Want to take? Go ahead, sorry.
Just very briefly, this is one of the most complex issue nowadays, the supply chain security. In NATO, it's one of the key cyber defense capability targets that we have adopted back in 2013 for any of the networks that are, as we said, military or strategic. But it becomes more and more complex issue in this environment, and frankly, it's one of the capability targets that has been, let's say, bit prolonged in terms of its implementation, but it's very much high on our agenda.
Just to add to that, I mean, the supply chain is global these days. It's hard to know where things are built, and particularly, down at the component level. So I think it's going to be very hard to have any 100% assurance with respect to the supply chain. So the question probably will be, I'll use the word integrating companies, or companies that can set standards. Can they set standards such that you reduce the risk, not to zero, but sufficiently far down that you are willing to take the risk? Because I don't know how we're going to disaggregate the supply chain. And even if you, quote, build in America, which I like a lot, of course, like we all do, but even things that are built in America have lots of things that come from elsewise, and it gives a lot of opportunities for that supply chain to be penetrated. So I think one needs to look more at a systemic solution rather than a component solution. But again, I said just a little bit before that I hung out the liberal arts, so you wouldn't want to take my technological capabilities beyond where they can go.
Trusted computing environment.
Yes, more on the line, exactly, more on those lines. So I think we're at the end of our time here. There's another panel yet to come. So let me thank very much each of the speakers. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you, audience.